Não tem vista do palco, tem vista da plateia.
Mensagem ao Galor. Mensagem, mensagem.
E aqui para vigilar. É o para vigilar.
Peraí. O vídeo, mas não pode ver, não vê a mim. O vídeo é o link é este.
Hello.
Não consigo entrar.
Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me well?
O som está desligado.
Mas tu estás com o som dali?
Não, peraí, está desligado. Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me well?
Onde é que está o som dali? Qual é o som? Não, qual é o som? Qual é que liga o som? Tira-o agora só para combinares. E depois metes.
Okay.
Se calhar, não.
Can you listen to me, Galor? Professor Galor?
Well, yes.
No. Oh, now you can listen to me, right? Professor?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay. We just on my computer now. I'm waiting 3 or 5 minutes to connect to the auditorium to have the sound from the auditorium. But I think we have a nice image and we have also sound. Just the technician is arriving. Sorry. No, she's arriving now. She's just arriving. Já temos o professor Galor online, and Felipe. Did you? The ceremony yesterday was very beautiful. No,
It was very nice. Very, very nice. It was quite moving. Yes.
Yeah. You had already had from University of Catholic of Leuven, right? Or
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
This was last year. Yes.
Have you seen the Portuguese version of your book?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes.
This is the Portuguese version. Very nice indeed. I'm doing here publicity to my colleagues. Just what time? How long do you have for the session? 1 hour and a half, and then you have the flight, right?
Yes. So I have 1 hour and 15 minutes. That's what we did. So I will talk for probably 50 minutes, and then I can take questions. That's
you talk for 1 hour and fashion. Okay, great. I must thank you a lot because it was what's called resilience and service to the public cause, because we understand that it was very difficult for you, and you still kept on the mission, which is very important, and we are really glad. I don't know, I'll be honest, I don't know if there will be many people because at this time, and it's the third day of the conference, but okay, I think let's try to see. I will record if you allow us to record the presentation. Oh, it is already recording. Okay, then we will edit it from the start of the talk.
Yeah, of course. So you want us to have the experiment now, or in a few minutes from the auditorium?
Let me just try. I just wanted to do the experiment. She's connecting the Zoom link, the material, just to see if the sound.
I wanted to know if the quality of the sound and the video
is the quality of the sound, the projection, to see if everything is okay in the auditorium. You see, now in my computer now it is. She's just connecting to the auditorium because you won't be seeing me, which is not important. You will be seeing the image of the auditorium, and we will be projecting you and the PowerPoint. I don't know. You probably have a PowerPoint, right?
Yes, I do. I do.
What's the time in Athens now?
It is 9:48. It's 2 hours.
Okay.
This was my confusion earlier because I somehow thought that there is an hour difference, but it's 2 hours.
Okay. I must be honest. I thought that when I received it, we were in the middle of the session. Okay, and the auditorium was full. And how can I make it? Okay, but if we start it out, that's the most important thing. Okay, conference room connecting to the audio. Okay, we have already projection. Okay, I'll try to put. I'll try to put. Can you listen to me now?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Conference room. Can you listen to me, Professor Galor? Não? Eu acho que a Ana Filipe ainda está a ligar o.
Acho que não está a ligar.
Deve estar a ligar o áudio ainda. Conference room. O quadro lá atrás é muita gente. Deve estar o quadro é. É para música. Isto. Pode parece ser bom. Testing the sound. Não sei se ele está. Are you listening to me, Professor Galor?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Ele ouve, mas está a falar, mas não se ouve, não. Daqui ouve.
Não, ela está.
Ela está. Não, mas ela disse. Mas eles têm um custo de som de equalização. Ainda temos 10 minutos até lá, mas. Já teve pedido para falar, não. É que aquilo não tem imagem ali. Pois é que aquilo não tem imagem ali. Ainda falta a imagem. Claro. Eu não sei. Good morning.
Hello, Oded. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? Hello.
Wait a second. Let's wait because we can.
¿Tienes que decir algo que lo grabe?
Não, não era. Não, não, estás. Eu estou gravando aí mesmo.
Ah, ok, ok.
Professor,
Ahí está.
Professor Galon, can you listen to us?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Só não está em casa. Ela deve ter o som do auditório em baixo. We already have image. So, there. Please, it shows here.
Yes, this one. Let's open it and see.
Não pode estar a minimizar. Chatice. You really need to put it here. I can put it in my computer. You can put it because I cannot memorize this. Wait a second. One second.
Yeah, no? Yeah.
That's you cannot minimize it. Just you could use my computer just to.
Okay.
I'll put my computer. I know my computer. We cannot minimize this. I'll try to put it like this. Okay, like this. Okay, like this. No sound working now. Escape. Let's see. Bien trabalho. Output.
You can add this.
Okay.
You can put it in full screen. Maybe go to 100. Well, maybe that's good.
Okay, now I must go to Galor. I must minimize. Go to the Zoom. Professor Galor, can you listen to us?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
No?
Mm-hmm.
Temos um. Bom dia. Isso não está. Acho que não está. Mas é que eu não estou a conseguir ouvir o Portugal, ele também não está a falar, mas. Mas isto não está a dar. Então, eles conseguem o som, não? Hã? Até o engenheiro limitado.
Does they see me? You?
Yes, yes, yes.
I can lie to him.
Ótimo, então,
Mhm.
Não, do Zoom.
Não.
Não.
I already told him.
Can do. No, we are trying to fix it with the voice. So would be
Okay. Yeah, I can see him online and I can see the auditorium, but it seems that what seems to be the problem?
Just sound of the auditorium.
the sound in the auditorium. But we are fixing it. Two people. Let me open my camera so you can see.
Okay, very well. Okay, bye.
A papai vai um bocadinho isso, mas pronto, está, né? Ele está ao lado do microfone. Teste, 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 teste. Eu vou fazer aqui um. Teste, teste. Teste, 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 teste. Sim, o som do Zoom que eu estou a fazer aqui.
Don't worry.
Ok, ok. Teste, 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 teste.
Já se ouve o som do auditório. Vamos fazer por. O computador está desligado, está correto. Não, é melhor não. Deixa eu ver o que é que eu. Deixa eu ver. Não chega mais gente. Vai em imagem. Já está o. Lá, faz o som apagado. Deixa-nos a pergunta. Tá pronto? Okay. Professor Galor, can you listen to me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good morning. So we are ready and we can listen to you. So we are ready, we can have a go. So we will start. Here we have Professor Yoshanan, which will do you a brief presentation.
Okay.
Okay. And then you will do 5 minutes and then you will have your plenary talk. Thank you a lot, Professor Galor.
Absolutely. Is the quality of the sound and the quality of the image very good?
Very well, good indeed. We can see all of this.
Okay, wonderful.
I'll just put first here a document that Professor Yoshanan wants to put. I'll give the.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Do you hear me? Okay, very good. So we are reaching the third day of the conference. And again, I would like to thank Jose Maria Montero, and I want to thank Miguel Osa for organizing the conference. I appreciate it very much. Oded Galor is a name, recognized name in growth theory. And he is now Herbert Goldberger Professor of Economics at Brown University. Brown University is one of the Ivy League in the United States. He's also a research fellow at CEPR, that is a well-known think tank, GLO, which you need to learn more about it, ISA in Germany. So these are the labor economics institute in some respect. He's also a research associate at the NBER, which is again considered to be very important, very prestigious, and many people that I know are part of this NBER. He's also a member of CES IFO, which is again an important research tank. He's elected foreign member of the Academia Europaea. He's also elected fellow of the Econometric Society, which is again very prestigious association. Oded is really the founder of the field that is today come with the name Unified Growth Theory. And as you can see, cracking the code of human progress, looking at the long range, thousands of years back, in order to explain growth and why nations are growing or not growing. He has pioneered the exploration of the impact of cultural adaptation. So it depends on the cultural adaptation, population diversity, the importance of being diverse population, and inequality in the process of development. He's the editor-in-chief of the well-known Journal of Economic Growth. He's the editor of the Journal of Population Economics and the co-editor of the Macroeconomic Dynamics. He has received, as you can see, various awards, including doctorate honors clause from UC Louvain, from Poznan University. This is where I met him because he also gave a lecture at Toron Copernicus University. Later on, he gave the Copernicus lecture in Toron. So Poznan University of Economics and Business. And today or in the next few days, he's going to get a doctorate honoris causa from the University of Athens in Greece. Professor Galor is the author of international bestseller, The Journal of Humanities, The Origin of Wealth and Inequality, which was translated also to Spanish and Portuguese. Yeah, both, I think, Spanish and Portuguese. I think it has been published in 30 languages worldwide. It was published last year in March 2022. And I'm very glad that I got the opportunity to again see, even by Zoom, Professor Oded Galor. Oded wanted to be here. There was some problems with changes in the University of Athens. So at the beginning, they were thinking that they will give it in another date, and as a result, he was planning to be here. Unfortunately, changes were made at the University of Athens, and this is why he's doing it by Zoom. But I'm sure his lectures will be very interesting. Thank you, Oded, for coming.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Galor. Now I will zoom you in. I'll put you in full screen. I'll close you. It's okay. I'll close the chat. I think that you can see.
Will you give me the permission to share my slides, or is it already there?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Okay. Can you see well? Okay, we have a go. Thank you. So I'll sit. We'll sit. Probably we'll sit in the first row. So I'll sit here. It's best for us to have the sound. So we have a go. We had already. Yes. Wait a second. He's just adjusting and putting the. He's putting the presentation.
Okay, so let me know if your side is ready.
Yes, right. It's ready. And okay. I think that when you start talking, your image will appear. Could you? Okay, please, you can start.
Okay, very well. So again, I apologize that I cannot be there in person, but I'm delighted to share with you some of the insights that I gathered over the past 3 decades. So my presentation will focus on my recent book, The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. And in this book, I attempt to explore the evolution of human societies over the entire course of human history, since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. Broadly speaking, I'm exploring 2 of the most fundamental mysteries that surround this journey. What I defined as the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 2 centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation, and the mystery of inequality, namely, what is the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations? Why some countries are rich and others are poor, and why inequality expanded so dramatically in the past 2 centuries. Well, over most of human existence, human life, as suggested by Hobbes, was nasty, brutish, and short. It was remarkably similar to that of other species on planet Earth. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards were very close to the subsistence level, and there were minor differences in living conditions across time and across space. In fact, only a few centuries ago, 1/4 of newborn died before reaching their first birthday, and nearly half of them did not reach their reproductive age. Large number of women perished during childbirth. Life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow band of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. And perhaps more strikingly, an economic crisis did not lead to belt-tightening, but rather to masturbation and extinction. And then, in the past 2 centuries, the world has experienced a major metamorphosis, an incredible transformation in living standards within and across societies. Income per capita in the world as a whole has increased 14-fold. life expectancy has more than doubled, and a great divergence took place in income per capita across countries and regions of the world. Now, to illustrate this dramatic metamorphosis that occurred in the past 200 years, consider for a moment residents of the city of Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago, at the time of Jesus, Roman-ruled Jerusalem, and whisk them forward in a time machine to Ottoman-ruled Jerusalem at the beginning of the 19th century. Despite this nearly 2,000-year jump forward in human history, these individuals will be able to adapt instantaneously to the new environment. Past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements will be merely incremental. Occupations would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would not alter, and as a result of it would not require changes in the individual mindset. But now, take these individuals from 19th century Jerusalem to contemporary Jerusalem, namely move them forward in a time machine, but this time only 200 years. This will be a devastating experience, a shocking experience. Past knowledge will be largely obsolete. Modern technologies would appear as witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skill, and life expectancy would instantly double, and as a result of it would require a future-oriented mindset, a mindset that can take education decisions, saving decisions, and life cycle decisions. So something very dramatic occurred in the past 200 years that has not occurred in the preceding 300,000-year period. And in contrast to a popular view that income per capita has increased gradually in the course of human history, in fact, what we observe is a gradual improvement in the level of technology that is converted into larger population rather than richer population. And what the world has experienced in the past 200 years is what I defined as a phase transition, namely an abrupt transformation once a tipping point has been reached. Now, to observe this metamorphosis, consider for a moment the evolution of income per capita in the past 2,000 years. As you can see quite clearly, over most of human existence, income per capita is very close to the subsistence level. And then, in the course of industrialization, we see this dramatic metamorphosis, a 14-fold increase in income per capita across the globe. Now, interestingly enough, if I would have removed the labels from the x-axis and the y-axis, and I would have shown this graph to a random scientist, this person would have suggested that this is in fact an output of a seismograph that detects tectonic activities and major eruptions. But in fact, this is the output of the evolution of income per capita across time. And this eruption is indeed an eruption, but it's an eruption in income per capita that occurred in the past 200 years. But interestingly enough, when this eruption is taking place, it is not taking place at the same time period in different places across the globe. It occurs earlier in Western Europe and their offshoots in North America, and much later, if at all, in sub-Saharan Africa. And consequently, since this transformation is associated with a 14-fold increase in income per capita on average in the world, an enormous gap is created in the world economy. And in fact, if you look at the inequality in the world economy today, and you compare it to the inequality that existed at the beginning of the 19th century, a very striking picture is emerging. inequality was negligible 200 years ago, and it is substantial in today's world. And therefore, if we would like to understand the roots of inequality today, we will have to have a better understanding of the forces that permitted some societies to take off earlier than others. In fact, a major fraction of the inequality across nations today can be traced to forces that operated in the distant past, forces that operated hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and strikingly enough, even tens of thousands of years ago. Now, the resolution of these two mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality, would require, therefore, the identification of the forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth across the globe as a whole, the identification of the forces that permitted the differential timing of the transition across the globe, namely permitted some societies to take off much earlier than others, and consequently, the identification of the role of historical and prehistorical initial conditions in this process. And importantly enough, the resolution of these two mysteries will provide policymakers with important insights about how to mitigate inequality across the globe. Namely, they will provide us with an understanding of the hurdles that are faced by less developed societies in their attempt to move from stagnation to growth, and consequently will provide us with the tools to design effective policies that can overcome these individual hurdles. Now, largely speaking, when we think about inequality today, it is quite apparent, and you will see it in the course of my presentation, that much of this inequality is originated in forces that operated in the distant past. And therefore, in order to understand the roots of inequality across the globe today, we have to develop a theory that can capture the process of development in its entirety, namely unified growth theory that I advanced in the past 2 or 3 decades. And unified growth theory is an attempt to understand how initial conditions that existed very much in the distant past are still affecting economic development across the globe and are behind much of the inequality as we see it today. Now, based on this introduction, it should be apparent to you that in order to understand economic growth, in order to understand modern prosperity, in order to understand the inequality that prevails across the globe today, we have to have a better understanding of the process of development in its entirety, since the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. So when you think about the process of development, one can segment this process into 3 fundamental phases: the Malthusian epoch, the post-Malthusian regime, and the modern growth regime. The Malthusian epoch originates 300,000 years ago with the emergence of modern humans in Africa, and it spans literally 99.9% of human existence till the eve of industrialization in the context of the most advanced societies in the world. And this Malthusian epoch is characterized by fascinating dualism. On the one hand, stagnation in income per capita, but on the other hand, certain dynamism in the context of population, adaptation, and technological progress. And it is this dynamism that ultimately, after 300,000-year period, is generating the takeoff from stagnation to growth. And what permits humanity to move into the modern growth regime in the post-1870 period in the most advanced societies in the world is the decline in fertility that frees the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. So as will become apparent, it is the Malthusian epoch that holds the key for the understanding of inequality today. And as I said, this Malthusian epoch is characterized by fascinating dualism, stagnation along with dynamism. Stagnation in living standards, as captured by income per capita that is fluctuated near the subsistence level, and stagnation in life expectancy that fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40 over 300,000 year period. But at the same time, during the Malthusian epoch, we see some dynamism. Dynamism in the context of technology, dynamism in the context of population, and dynamism in the context of human adaptation. At any point in time, the pace of technological progress is slow. The pace of population growth is quite slow. And the pace of human adaptation is slow as well. But over 300,000 year period, this low pace is generating an incredible momentum that will ultimately bring about the transition from stagnation to growth. So we move from stone tool technologies that existed 300,000 years ago to steam engine technologies in the eve of industrialization. And we move from about 2.5 million people that are residing on planet Earth on the eve of the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago to nearly 1 billion people in the midst of industrialization, 400-fold increase in the size of the human population, despite the stagnation in living standards. And at the same time, we see great amount of adaptation of humans to their environments. And it is this Malthusian dynamism that ultimately triggers the transition from stagnation to growth. Now, one key element during this period is the impact of technological progress on the size of the human population. So unlike today's world, technological progress results in an increase in income per capita only in the short run. This increase in resources and income per capita is resulting in a proportionate increase in the size of the human population, partly due to the reduction in child mortality and the increase in fertility. So the increase in resources supports larger population, and consequently income per capita inevitably reverts back to the initial equilibrium position. And consequently, quite strikingly, this is a time period in which technologically advanced societies, such as China, are enjoying significantly higher population density, but they are not more prosperous. They have the same level of income per capita, more or less, than other societies that are significantly less advanced technologically. So technological progress, unlike today's world, is converted into more people rather than into richer people. In addition, during the Malthusian epoch, we see great amount of adaptation of humans to their environment. The Malthusian pressure affected the size of the human population, as I just suggested, but in addition, it affects the composition of the human population. Namely, it affects the traits that are being selected in the course of human existence. So traits, whether they're cultural or individual, that are complementary to the technological environment and are complementary to the technological progress, generate tautologically higher income. They're more beneficial, and as a result of it, they're rewarded better than otherwise. But this is a time period in which higher income is converted into higher reproductive success. And this implies that, in fact, these traits that are generating higher income becomes more prevalent in the population. And consequently, human adaptation over this time period raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the growth process, reinforcing the process of development and ultimately the takeoff from stagnation to growth. So in the course of human history, the journey of humanity is governed by what I defined as the wheels of change: technological progress, population growth, and human adaptation. They are rotating and reinforcing one another in the course of human history. The size of the human population and the composition of the human population is affecting technological progress. More people, more potential innovators, more technological progress. More adaptable people, more technological progress. But at the same time, technological progress, as I said before, supports more people and more adaptable people. And as a result of it, we see this virtuous cycle, reinforcing cycle between the size of the human population, the composition of the human population, and technological progress. And the wheels of change are rotating as a result of it at an ever-increasing pace. But nevertheless, over a 300,000-year period, there is hardly any change in the standard of living. Technological progress is converted into more people rather than into more prosperous people. But ultimately, after 300,000-year period, the pace of technological progress accelerates beyond the critical threshold, beyond the point in which, in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment, individuals must start to invest in their human capital. Human capital becomes important in order to allow individuals to navigate this stormy technological environment. Human capital becomes important to cope with rapidly changing technological environment. So parents realize that the changes is taking place, and they start to invest in the education of their children. But the level of consumption is too small to afford this investment. They cannot reduce their consumption so as to support this investment in education of their children. So they have to economize on additional element in their budget constraint, namely the number of children. So human capital formation triggers a reduction in family sizes. And this is critical because, in fact, for the first time in human history, it is no longer the case that technological progress is counterbalanced by a proportionate increase in the size of the human population. And consequently, the growth process, for the first time in human history, is freed from the counterbalancing effect of population. And technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth, all these three forces are permitting the world to sail into the sustained growth regime. Now you can see an illustration of this mechanism in the chart in front of you. Humanity starts in Africa 300,000 years ago. The size of the human population is very modest. But unlike other species, humans are equipped by a powerful tool, the human brain. And the human brain permits humanity to carve the environment in which they operate, namely to advance technology so as to generate more resources from the environment. So despite the fact that the size of the population is modest, technological progress is taking place at a very slow pace. Technological progress, in turn, supports more people and supports human adaptation. And consequently, we see this reinforcing interaction between the size of the human population, the composition of the human population, and technological progress. And this operates consistently in the course of human history. And as I said, despite the fact that technological progress becomes faster and faster, population growth increases proportionately, and there is no change in income per capita. But over this time period, the latent demand for human capital increases gradually, and ultimately, technological progress becomes so rapid so as to require human capital to cope with these changes in the technological environment. Human capital formation takes place, it generates a fertility decline, and the demographic transition permits the world to sail into the sustained growth regime. Now, this phase transition that I just illustrated is similar to a phase transition that you're all familiar with, a phase transition from water to gas. So as you know, when you heat water in a tea kettle, initially there is no change in the state of the water. It remains liquid. But ultimately, once the water temperature reaches a critical threshold, we see the process of evaporation and we see the transition from liquid to gas. The same was true in the course of human history. For a long period of time, technological progress was getting larger and larger and larger, and the pace was faster and faster and faster. But nevertheless, there was no change in the phase in which humanity operated. Humanity remained in the agricultural stage of development, and income per capita was very close to the subsistence level. But then, once the critical threshold in terms of technological progress was reached, similar to 100 degrees Celsius in the context of boiling water, we see this dramatic improvement in living standards that are bringing us into the modern growth regime. But interestingly enough, when you observe the water and you observe the evaporation process, you must have noticed that some water molecules are converted into a state of gas earlier than others. And as a result of it, there is a divergence in these water molecules. Some of them are in a gas state and others in a liquid state. The same was true in the course of human history. Not all societies move from the agricultural stage of development into the modern growth regime at the same time. And as a result of it, an incredible divergence took place in the world economy. And those societies that took off first were located in a better position, if you wish, in the teapot, precisely as is the case with water molecules. Those that are positioned in a certain place in the teapot are taking off earlier than others. Same is true in the world economy. Those societies that were blessed by better geographical conditions were the ones that managed ultimately to take off earlier than otherwise. And this generated an incredible inequality in the world economy. So when you read my book, and I urge you to read the book, it is jargon-free, it is accessible, and it is inspiring in terms of the evidence and the theories that it represents. So if you read the book, you will see that the book is divided into two parts. The first one starts in Africa 300,000 years ago and march forward, resolving the mystery of economic growth as I presented to you at the moment. The second part reverses the time and look at inequality today and ask what are the roots of inequality moving backward in time all the way back to Africa. So when you think about the roots of inequality today, it is tempting to think about the causes of uneven development in terms of what we define today as the proximate causes, namely cross-country differences in education, in machinery, and in technologies. And this is true tautologically. Those societies that are more advanced have more education, better machinery, and better technologies. But this doesn't take us anywhere. Naturally, the question is why some societies fail to invest properly in physical and human capital, and why some societies fail to adopt advanced technologies. And in order to address these questions, we will have to understand what is the role of historical and prehistorical conditions in forming barriers in the process of accumulation and in the process of technological adoption. Why is it the case that conditions that existed in the distant past permitted some societies to take decisions about accumulation and technological adoption that are conducive to the growth process and prevented others from taking similar action in this respect? So when we think about the roots of inequality as we see it today, We can think about deeper roots, namely colonialism, institutions, and cultural characteristics. But as we will realize sooner or later, colonialism, institutions, and cultural characteristics are largely predicated on what I defined as the ultimate roots, namely their byproduct of the geographical environment and their byproduct of the degree of population diversity that is distributed unevenly across the globe. So let's start our march backward and move first to the colonial era. So colonialism undoubtedly contributed to uneven development. Colonialism was associated with extraction, and colonialism was associated with asymmetric trade. So colonies, for instance, were induced to specialize in the production of agricultural goods and raw materials, goods that to a large extent are dead end in terms of technological spillover and are dead end in terms of the demand for human capital. So in those societies, we see a reduction in human capital formation because these goods do not demand education or human capital. And consequently, these reinforcing forces that I described before are operating slower than otherwise, and the decline in fertility that is so instrumental for the transition from stagnation to growth is occurring significantly later. Consequently, the colonialism in the context of the colonies is delaying the takeoff from stagnation to growth. It slows down the rotations of the wheels of change. In contrast, colonizers specialize in the production of manufactured goods. Think about England trading with the colonies, and as a result of it, specializing in the production of manufactured goods. Specialization in the production of manufactured goods is very beneficial because this production process is human capital intensive in its nature, and as a result of it, it fosters human capital formation and it fosters the decline in fertility. And consequently, in the context of the colonizers, it expedited the rotation of the wheels of change, and it expedited the transition to modern growth. So colonialism, as I said, is undoubtedly important in understanding the differential pace of the rotations of the wheels of change. But in fact, this is not the root cause of inequality, because colonialism in itself is predicated on uneven development earlier that permitted some societies to colonize others. So as we step backward in human history, we are led into the role of institutions in the process of development, what I defined as the fingerprints of institutions. So many argues that we observe in the world the emergence of differential institutions. In some places, we see the emergence of growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions, democratic institutions, and in other places, we see the emergence of growth-retarding, extractive institutions. And some argue that, in fact, this explains a significant portion of the variations in inequality across the globe. But when we think about institutions, it is very important to realize that, to a large extent, institutions are a byproduct of the process of development. So there are some instances in the course of human history in which institutions are emerging at random critical junctures. For instance, the Black Death that is decimating European population in the middle of the 14th century is generating scarcity of labor, both in the rural sector and in the urban sector. And in England, this high demand for labor in the urban sector is causing pressure on the landed aristocracy to relinquish the nature of the relationship between the serfs on the land and the aristocrats, And this brings about the decline of feudalism so as to prevent the outflow of workers from the agricultural sector into the urban sector. So here we see a decline in feudalism that is leading ultimately into the emergence of property rights and perhaps an early industrialization in England as opposed to other places. And this is connected to a random critical juncture, namely the Black Death. Another good example of a random critical juncture is the Glorious Revolution and the impact of the Glorious Revolution on the emergence of constitutional monarchy in England and potentially early industrialization in England. Again, random critical juncture that affected institutions. And perhaps the most striking example is the division of Korea along the 38th parallel. So this division is quite capricious. It occurred along the 38th parallel, but it could have occurred differently. And the division was such that the North became a sphere of influence of communism, the South a sphere of influence of the West, and over a 70-year period, we see that South Korea is 24 times richer than North Korea, namely institutions themselves in a place that is geographically homogeneous and ethnically homogeneous, generated the incredible divide between North Korea and South Korea. Here, institutions explain nearly 100% of the variations in income per capita across the globe. But this is a deceiving picture, because as I said, I can count these random critical junctures probably on one hand. The rule was very different. Institutions mostly evolve gradually in the course of human history. One of the most important revolutions that humanity experienced is the so-called Neolithic Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, that occurred as early as 12,000 years ago. And the Agricultural Revolution increased tremendously population density and led into the emergence of cities, states, and empires. Population density generated demand for institutions that can coordinate actions of individuals, protect their property rights, and permit the implementation of important public goods. So again, it is economic development that to a large extent brought about the demand for institutions. And in this particular case, it is truly a geographical phenomena, namely geographical conditions that were conducive to an earlier emergence of the Neolithic Revolution led into the emergence of institutions. Second, the nature of institutions, whether they are inclusive institutions or extractive institutions, whether they're democratic institutions or autocratic institutions, can be mapped into earlier geographical conditions. Europe is characterized by land fragmentation, and land fragmentation is leading inherently into political competition. It ultimately generates inclusive institutions. China, in contrast, is characterized by geographical connectivity. Geographical connectivity reducing competition and generate, as a result of it, political uniformity and extractive institutions. So again, geographical endowment, land fragmentation in Europe versus geographical connectivity in China is generating differential institutions across the globe, inclusive institutions in some societies and extractive institutions in others. And a third example that is very important is the suitability of the land for large plantations. If you consider for a moment Central America. In Central America, there are certain crops that are native to the place that requires large plantations. Why is it very important? Because large plantations are leading naturally into the concentration of land ownership and consequently the concentration of political power. And this concentration of political power is ultimately permitting the implementation of extractive institutions and even slavery. So yet again, it is economic development, and in particular geography, that affected the nature of institutions that emerge across the globe. And consequently, we would like to understand the roots of inequality across the globe. We will have to step backward and to consider the role of geography. But before doing it, we have to consider the cultural factor, informal institutions. So in the course of human history, adherence to cultural norms was essential for survival. Norms reflected the cumulative collective wisdom of the society that was gathered over centuries and millennia by many generations. And it permitted individuals to act as if based on the understanding of their surrounding. And what we see in the course of human history is the emergence of differential cultural norms across societies. Some societies are adopting growth-enhancing cultural traits, and others growth-retarding cultural traits. But yet again, there are rare examples of cultural mutations in the course of human history. Typically, culture was a byproduct of the process of development. So for instance, if you think about the geographical roots of important cultural traits, perhaps the most important cultural trait for economic development and economic growth is a future-oriented mindset, a mindset that can plan for the future. And if you look at the variations in future-oriented mindset across the globe, it is quite striking that there are tremendous differences across countries and continents in the context of future-oriented mindset. And what are the roots of these differences in this important cultural trait? Future-oriented mindset that, as I said, governs education decisions, saving decisions, and technological adoption. It turns out that what mattered mostly was the natural return to agricultural investment. If you resided in a place where nature blessed you with crops, where the reward for cultivation was very high, nature forced you to learn how to plant, with some delay to harvest, and to store seeds for the next period of cultivation. And nature consequently trained you how to be future-oriented in your decision-making. On the other hand, if you came from a region when the return to agricultural investment was very low, you were not engaged in planting, you were not engaged in delayed gratification that is associated with the waiting period from planting to harvesting, and you did not learn how to store seeds for future production. And consequently, your ability to delay gratification and your ability to plan for the future was affected adversely by the environment in which you operated. So this is one, and perhaps the most important cultural trait that was affected again by the geographical environment. The second one that is very intriguing is the suitability of the land for the use of the plow. Again, planet Earth is not equally suitable for the use of the plow. And some societies adopted the plow thousands of years earlier than others. Now, why is it important? Well, it turns out that prior to the adoption of the plow, agricultural cultivation was equally shared by men and women. There was no gender role in agricultural production. But the introduction of the plow that requires significant amount of upper body strength led gradually into a gender division in production. Men were confined to agricultural production, and women, as a result of it, were confined to work within the household. And consequently, this gender division of labor generated gender biases that persist till today. Labor force participation of women in Southern Europe that adopted the plow earlier is significantly lower than labor force participation in Northern Europe, where the plow was adopted much later. So again, geographical conditions that are affecting cultural traits. So this leads us to the realization that one of the important ultimate factors in the existing inequality across the globe is geography, namely geographical characteristics such as soil quality, climate, the disease environment, and geographical isolation that has an indirect long shadow impact on the evolution of cultural characteristics and institutional characteristics. And in fact, if you ask yourself what fraction of the variations in inequality today in the wealth of nations can be attributed to geographical conditions, it is about 30 to 40%, where, for instance, institutions would capture about 2 to 9%, depending on your modeling assumptions. Now, geography had a direct impact as well. It affected the disease environment and consequently labor productivity, human capital formation, and in addition, it generated some isolation that affected trade and technological progress. But this direct impact of geography is gradually mitigated by the diffusion of medical technology from the north to the south, the diffusion of transportation technology from the north to the south, and the diffusion of IT technologies that permit, again, societies to be closer to one another geographically and permits human capital formation and higher labor productivity without being compromised by the disease environment. So it is mostly the indirect impact of geography through culture and institutions that affect economic development in this dimension. So when we think about the role of geography and we step back, as I said, in the course of human history, we are led into the legacy of the agricultural revolution that occurred as early as 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. So this is the transition of humanities from hunter-gatherer tribes into sedentary agricultural communities. And this transition is associated with the emergence of a non-food producing class, a class that is associated with knowledge creation in the form of science, in the form of technology, and in the form of written languages. And if you think about variations in the timing of the Neolithic Revolution across the globe, and as I said before, in the Fertile Crescent, the Neolithic Revolution occurred 12,000 years ago, in China around 9,500 years ago, and in some places across the globe only a few hundred years ago, then this generates a technological head start for those societies that started to toy with better technologies and more advanced knowledge earlier, and consequently led potentially into a gap in the wealth of nations. So in fact, Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steels, argued that the variation in the timing of the Neolithic Revolution is the origin of global inequality across the globe. So what was his argument based upon? He argued that earlier Neolithic revolution in Eurasia reflects geographical conditions that were conducive to biodiversity and led into a larger number of domesticable species of plants and animals that permitted an earlier transition to agriculture. In addition, he argued that the east-west orientation of the Eurasia landmass, as opposed to the north-south orientation of the America or Africa, led into the diffusion of agricultural practices along similar latitude lines. And consequently, Diamond argued that early onset of the Neolithic Revolution is beneficial for economic development in the course of human history. But in fact, the Diamond argument is relevant only for the Middle Ages. In fact, it has no explanatory power for the inequality that we see in the world today. And why is it so? Because his argument about technological head start is completely correct. Namely, those societies that experienced the Neolithic Revolution earlier had, in fact, a technological edge. But what he failed to understand is that, in fact, it has no impact on prosperity today because comparative advantage in agriculture that is associated with an earlier transition to the Neolithic is a technological dead end. It has limited technological externalities, it has limited demand for human capital, and consequently, as we move into the modern growth regime, it becomes a liability. So we move into a globalized world in which people can trade with one another, having comparative advantage in the production of agricultural goods is, to a large extent, a dead end. And consequently, the technological head start that Diamond alluded to is being offset by comparative advantage in agriculture that is detrimental to development. So ultimately, the explanatory power of the Neolithic Revolution in terms of comparative development today is virtually none. And this leads us all the way back to where we are all originated from, namely Africa. So as you know, humanity emerges in Africa 300,000 years ago. And over this time period, humanity is accumulating mutation and accumulating certain degree of diversity. At a certain point, as early as 200,000 years ago, we see a gradual movement of humans from Africa into other regions of the world. Most of this in early migration is either become extinct due to small population size or recede back to Africa due to adverse climatic conditions associated with the Ice Age. But ultimately, the migration that occurs around 60,000 years ago is leaving a great imprint. And in fact, all humanity today is originated from this wave of migration. So these waves of migration is permitting humanity to enter, say, Europe around 45,000 years ago, to cross the Bering Strait 25,000 years ago, to march into North America 23,000 years ago, and into South America 14,000 years ago. Now, why is it important for the understanding of comparative development? Well, during this exodus of modern humans from Africa, departing populations carried with them only a subset of the diversity that existed in the parental colonies. This can be cultural diversity, phenotypic diversity, behavioral diversity, and linguistic diversity. In addition, migration was sequential, and consequently, the further people migrated from Africa, the less diverse they are. And this implies that one should expect lower diversity among ancestral population at greater migratory distance from Africa. So humanity is emerging in Africa, as I said, and consider this as the degree of diversity in Africa at the time. Populations are departing from Africa into, say, the Fertile Crescent. They carried with them only a subset of the diversity that existed in Africa. Why is it so? Because the size of the original population is limited in size, the size of the departing population is very small, and as a result of it, it's not a representative sample of the population that existed in Africa. In addition, since the population is very small, it is subjected to population bottlenecks and genetic drift that is making the population even more homogeneous than otherwise. People are residing here for a long period of time. And at a certain point in time, population pressure is causing some people to move west into Europe or east into Asia. And again, the departing population is even less diverse than the one that existed in the Fertile Crescent, and the same holds. And as a result of it, the further people migrated from Africa, namely the population of Native Americans in South America, would be expected to be the least diverse in the world. And the evidence is striking in this respect. If you look at migratory distance from Africa, distance by foot, that can be as large as 30,000 kilometers from Africa, the further people from Africa are, the less diverse they are. The most diverse population that you can see here is in Africa, followed by the Middle Eastern population, European population, Asian population, Oceanian population, and Native Americans in the America. And in fact, migratory distance from Africa alone explain 84% of the variations in this sample in this particular case, it measures diversity in terms of diversity in genes. But in fact, this is true regardless of whether we focus on genetic diversity or cultural diversity. If you look at folkloric diversity, the same pattern would emerge. The further people are from Africa, the smaller is the degree of folkloric diversity. But again, the question is, why is it so important? It is so important because diversity is associated with two conflicting effects in terms of economic prosperity. On the one hand, diversity is having a positive effect on creativity and innovations. Diversity is associated with cross-fertilization of ideas, cross-pollination of ideas, complementarities in the production process, and this is conducive for innovations. But on the other hand, diversity has an adverse effect on social cohesiveness. It is associated with mistrust. It is associated with disagreement about the desirable public goods, and it is associated consequently with conflicts. So there are conflicting effects of diversity on economic development. And this implies that if there are positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations, and if there are positive and diminishing effects of homogeneity on social cohesiveness, there must be a sweet spot, an intermediate level of diversity that is most conducive for development. Namely, there must be an optimal migratory distance from Africa, accounting for my post-1500 migration of the population that will be conducive for development. Namely, one should expect hump-shaped relationship between migratory distance from Africa, population diversity, and economic development. Societies that are very diverse will suffer from social non-cohesiveness. Societies that are overly homogeneous will suffer from the lack of innovativeness, and societies in between will flourish in terms of economic development. And the evidence is striking in this respect. If you look at panel A, you can see quite clearly that there is an intermediate level of diversity that is conducive for development. If you look at, and this is based on population density in the year 1500, so these are the Middle Ages. Again, if you look at the Middle Ages, urbanization rate in the year 1500, see this pronounced hump-shaped relationship. Panel C, this is the relationship between diversity and income per capita in the past 20 years. Again, pronounced hump-shaped relationship. But something very striking has to do with the identity of the countries that have the optimal level of diversity. In the year 1500, the level of diversity that is conducive for development is the one that is prevalent in China, Korea, and Japan. Societies that we hardly associate with a level of diversity that is conducive for development. But this is a different time period. It's a time period in which technological progress is not as rapid as it is today, and therefore the benefits of diversity in terms of social cohesiveness that is so prevalent in China, Korea, and Japan is sufficient to compensate for the detrimental effect on innovations. And these societies are dominating the scene. But if you look at today's world, the society that is at the peak of the hump is in fact the US society. Namely, as we move into a more demanding technological environment, it will be the case that societies that are incredibly more diverse, like the US society, has the upper hand. It is still the case that societies that are incredibly diverse are suffering from conflicts. This will be, say, Ethiopia in Africa. And societies that are very homogeneous will not flourish as well. But societies that have significant amount of diversity will have the upper hand. And you can see it in the context of countries, so you can see it in the context of all ethnic groups that are present in the ethnographic atlas, 1,265 of them. If you look at their development in the past 12,000 years, you can see quite clearly this hump-shaped relationship and the domination of an intermediate level of diversity over extreme levels of diversity in terms of economic development. Now, so if you think about the initial chart that I showed you before, as I said, the wheels of change are rotating in the course of human history. The size of the human population affects technological progress. Technological progress affects the size of the human population and the adaptation of the human population. And the wheels of change are rotating in the course of human history. But they're not rotating in a vacuum. If, in fact, you are blessed by certain geographical conditions that were good for the emergence of growth-enhancing cultural traits or growth-enhancing institutional traits, then the wheels of change will rotate more rapidly than otherwise. If, in fact, your population, your ancestral population, is at a level of migratory distance from Africa that is conducive for the level of diversity of your population, again, you will have faster technological progress than otherwise, and as a result of it, you will reach the critical level in terms of technological progress that is inducing the transition from stagnation to growth earlier than otherwise. So much of the inequality as we see it across the globe today has to do with the differential rotation in the wheels of change that can be mapped into geographical conditions and the exodus of humans from Africa 60 to 90,000 years ago.
Professor Galor? Okay. Slide 46. One slide. Okay. Yes. Okay. Could you should try to enter again because you're not already.
Try to enter again. That would be sufficient.
You were just on slide 46. You were almost finishing, and you have a plan to catch at 9.
Oh, good. I assume we can stay more than 9.
Okay. minute. Yes.
Understood. So you're trying to reconnect, right? Okay, and in the meantime, I will try to get your presentation because I think we have a copy of it, so I can tell you. No, we don't. So, Oded, okay. I managed to enter. I will. Okay.
Okay.
Well, at least it will give you some time.
Pois agora.
Okay, can you see me and hear me well?
Yes, perfect. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so let me just share the screen again.
You had some time to drink some water, hopefully, right? We were on slide 46. Can you listen to us? Professor Galor. Bem, enquanto esperam, podem.
Do you have the email address of Miguel?
Yes, you could send
I think. Oh, here I'm back. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, Oded, you can.
Okay, I think you can.
We can see you.
We can see you and listen to you.
Yes, I will.
Oh, great, great. It's functioning. Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, so sorry about this glitch. And so,
You need maybe one slide.
so as I said, if you think about the determinants of the pace of the rotation of the wheels of change, They are determined by deep-rooted factors and ultimate factors, namely they are determined by colonialism, institutions, and culture, as in turn was influenced by geography and human diversity. So those societies that were placed in an optimal migratory distance from Africa, those societies that were placed on geographical conditions that were conducive to the development of institutions and culture that are growth enhancing, are taking off earlier than others, and great inequality is emerging in the world economy. So to conclude, if you think about the future journey of humanity, one important question is whether, in fact, given the fact that I showed you that much of the inequality across the globe today is originated in forces that operated in the distant past, is it the case that history is a fate? Is it the case that, in fact, some societies are doomed to fail, some societies are fortunate to succeed, and policymakers cannot change the course of human history? So in fact, my book, The Journey of Humanity, suggests that history is not a fate. And in fact, by considering our history, but in contrast to the policy that is advocated by the World Bank, the IMF, and the Washington Consensus, according to which one policy will fit all nations at once, the main lesson of the journey of humanity is one policy does not fit all nations. An optimal policy will have to be a policy that is country-specific, history-specific, and geography-specific. Namely, if some societies, due to migratory distance from Africa, are relatively diverse, the policy, education policies in these societies will have to foster social cohesiveness. But another society that is equally poor, but is relatively homogeneous, will have, in fact, to find a way to foster cultural diversity by teaching students how to think outside of the box, and by fostering, as I said, cultural diversity to compensate for the lack of diversity that is characterized of their location. More generally, based on the journey of humanity, the key for sustaining the age of abundance is further decline in fertility, investment in adaptable education as opposed to vocational education, gender equality that will permit further participation of women in the labor force and will induce further decline in fertility, tolerance so as to mitigate the cost of diversity, and fostering diversity so as to benefit from cross-pollination of ideas. So thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Oded. And let's go to the question. So here's the microphone. Here is the first question. Second row.
Hi, Professor Galor. Could you please confirm you hear me? Do you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Okay, thank you. This is Juan Jimeno from Bank of Spain. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Yours is a fascinating view of how technology, demography, history, institutions, interaction among them, all of them conditioned by geography, shape the journey of humanity in terms of growth and inequality. I want to ask you about the future, because if you think about the future, there are signs in all of these factors that might suggest that we are in a new phase. If you think about technology, then it seems that this time is different. Robotics and artificial intelligence have more disruptive and displacement effects across the skill distributions that probably previous technological changes. if you think about demography, there is a big transition going on, big decrease in fertility across the world, very rapid population aging. If you think about history, well, we have a few historical episodes in the last 2 decades. And institutions, well, liberal democracies are now in some danger because of the emergence of populism, totalitarianism, and, you know, concerning science in many countries. And even even geography, you might think that geography is invariant, but if you think about climate change, then geography and the implication of geography is also changing. So my question is, do you think that we are entering a new phase in this journey of humanity? And if so, what are the characteristics of this new phase may be? What kind of growth and inequality you see in the future?
Thank you very much. That's a fantastic question, and I'm delighted to address it. So indeed, so when we think about the journey of humanity, it appears that this journey was not derailed by any past events from the long-run trajectory. So if we think about the trajectory of humanity in the course of human history, humanity faced major challenges in the course of human history. And in each of these challenges, human ingenuity and human resilience assured that humanity prevailed. And in fact, each of these elements did not generate major deviations of humanity from its long-run trend. And let me mention a few examples. So if you think about the Black Death, 40% of the European population is decimated over this time period, but nevertheless, we see that humanity is emerging out of the Black Death with greater resolve, with better technologies, and with better institutions that existed before. Or if you think about events that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, and World War I, World War II. These were devastating effects for the population that lived through them, but nevertheless, when we look at the grand arc of human development, we do not see that humanity is being derailed from its long-run march. So to a large extent, when I review the history of humanity over the past 300,000 years, it appears as if the march of humanity is unstoppable. And what you raise is a very important element, which is basically humanity is now, for instance, faced by the issues of climate change, or we saw some setbacks in the context of conflicts within the European continent. And the question is whether this particular events are likely to derail humanity from its relentless march forward. I want to distinguish between climate change and, say, the crisis in Ukraine. So from my viewpoint, crisis of Ukraine and generally the trend that we observe in terms of democratization in the past centuries is encouraging. We look at it very broadly. I think that the trend is quite clear. People, individuals across the globe that tasted the wonderful taste of liberties are not willing to relinquish these liberties. And we could see it very nicely in the context of the resilience of the Ukrainian people, despite the fact that they were inferior in terms of soldiers in the battlefield. They managed to prevail in the battlefield because once they tested the sweet test of liberties, they were not willing to give up this in any type of context. In addition, what was quite clear and what was quite evident in this context is that authoritarian regimes do not function very well. We knew that they're not functioning very well economically, and this what led into the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in the past few decades. But now we realize that they don't function well even in what used to be their comparative advantage, namely the ability to marshal force and brutality. They're not even good at that because in the absence of meritocracy, it appears that you don't have even a well-functioning army. So if I learn from the Ukraine crisis something, is that in fact, the forces of freedom will ultimately prevail in the near future, in the sense that autocracies will find it very difficult to survive in the long run because people are exposed to the virtues of liberties and they're not willing to be ruled by autocratic regimes. And in addition, the Western world or the free world is willing to take actions collectively so as to stop aggression and to suppress the emergence of autocracy. Now, so this is my view, broadly speaking, in the context of the Ukraine crisis. You think about political polarization and political extremism, this is an issue, but again, I think that this is part of the movement of the pendulum. Naturally, we're not living in a stable world, generally speaking, and as a result of it, yes, from time to time, there will be an overreaction that will be reflected in political extremism. I don't think that this will survive in the long run. And I'm quite confident that, again, as people realize the danger of autocratic regimes and polarization and extremism in terms of depriving them from their own civil liberties, people will act differently and will protect the single most important elements in their life, which is their liberty. Now, as to climate change, that's a bit more difficult. And one can argue that this is perhaps the greatest challenge the humanity has ever faced, and a crisis that can potentially derail humanity from its long-term path. But here too, I would like to express a somewhat optimistic view. But if we think about climate change, the trend in climate change is basically emerging as the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. It is industrial pollution that is generating carbon emission and start a process that reach a catastrophic stage in these days. But at the same time, we know that the acceleration in technological progress and industrialization brought about three additional important factors. The first one that we talked about is the increase in the level of education. The second one is the increase in human ingenuity, and the third one is the decline in fertility. All these three factors are critical in mitigating climate change. The decline in fertility is essential because it is in fact people that are polluting planet Earth, and one can show that if we reduce the size of the human population by 1%, we can increase the gross of income per capita by nearly 7% without affecting carbon emission. Namely, by targeting fertility, by having lower level of fertility, we are in a better position to mitigate the current trend of climate change, not to reverse it, but to mitigate it. Second, we have a much more educated population. And as a result of it, we are in a good position to explain to each individual on planet Earth what are the potential consequences of climate change, and consequently, via education, we can mitigate again some of the adverse consequences. And finally, and most importantly, we reach a stage in which human ingenuity is so significant that, again, it is bound to rescue us from this type of catastrophe if incentives will be aligned, and at the same time, we will not be complacent, and we will put all the necessary provision in place so as to assure that environmental protection is in place carbon emission regulations are being enforced and are being even stricter than what we see at the moment, etc. So broadly speaking, I think that once the incentives will be there, given the fact that fertility is declining so dramatically, we will have 2 to 3 decades to operate and to find these revolutionary technologies that hopefully will make this climate crisis a fading memory, perhaps in the end of the century. And now, the last question that you ask is whether we are entering into a different phase in the context of technological progress and what are the implications of it. So naturally, part of my argument is that the transition from stagnation to growth was associated with technological acceleration. It generated a demand for human capital, brought about a fertility decline, and brought much of the inequality that we see across the globe. I think the artificial intelligence that is entering into our life very significantly is going to accelerate this process. In fact, artificial intelligence will displace in the short run more workers than otherwise, will generate further inequality, and as a result of it, potentially can lead into social unrest unless societies will be prepared to help people navigate this stormy period. So part of what I suggested before was that we have to invest in education in a very precise way, in the sense that we really need to learn to invest in flexible education, adaptable education. We need to teach our children how to adapt to a changing technological environment rather than imparting them with skills that can be outdated by changes in the technological regime. But in addition, we have to realize that the new technology will displace a significant portion of the labor force, and consequently, we need to use perfect equality of opportunities that will permit every individual to participate in this technological lottery. There will be no sense of unfairness in society. But in addition, we have to be in a position to provide safety nets and training mechanisms so as to allow people that are being displaced by this technology to adapt and to complement this technology rather than being displaced by it. But overall, I'm optimistic about the march of humanity. I think that despite the fear from the artificial intelligence, I think that ultimately it will generate great amount of prosperity, great amount of economic growth, will reduce the amount of hours that we invest in working per week, and will permit greater human prosperity along with inequality. But as I said, responsible action can mitigate the adverse consequences of inequality and can assure at least the appearance of fairness in the way that that income is being distributed across societies.
Okay, great. And we have time for one. Go ahead. After this question, I would like, as a student, to have a question. So make sure that the young generation will ask a question. Think about it. Collaborate, adapt, I don't know, but do it.
Hello, ¿se oye? Good morning. Thank you so much for the speech. And following previous question and also your last thought, is a very short and direct question.
1 second. Oded, do you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Very good.
Okay, great. Do you think we are still on the great divergence? Or maybe from the beginning of the 21st century, because the growth rates in Asia, in developing countries, higher growth rates than in the offshoots or Western countries, we could say that we enter in the great convergence, just that. In the long run, do you think we are still in the great divergence? Looking ahead.
Yeah, so this is a good question. So as I said, indeed, this differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth led into a great divergence in income per capita across the globe. But at the moment, we do see the diffusion of technologies from the north to the south. We see, as I said before, the diffusion of medical technology, IT technology, and transportation technologies. And as a result of it, we mitigate some of the forces that are holding some countries behind. So again, once we will be equipped with better technologies, and once we will have a better understanding of holding countries behind, and once we will have a better understanding of the level of diversity that is holding countries behind, we will be in a very good position to design policies that can expedite this convergence across the globe. Now, in the absence of these policies, I do believe that we will see convergence, not a tremendous convergence, but we will see a convergence. But if in addition, we will complement this inherent force, and we will complement them by proper policies that will design, as I said, to design a level of diversity in each societies that will be conducive for development, policies that will be designed to supplement certain cultural traits that are not growth enhancing. For instance, instilling the ability of people to plan for the future, and as a result of it, to educate themselves properly, to invest properly in technologies, and to invest properly in the future, we will see much more significant convergence. But broadly speaking, yes, we saw a process of divergence. I think we start to see some convergence. True convergence will require additional policies that, as I said, will design the proper diversity across the globe and will design the proper cultural traits that are growth enhancing.
Good. Any question from the young population? Okay, anyone else? Okay, so Oded, I would like to thank you for your presentation. I personally don't buy the issue of fertility. I think when the cost of education is going down, will go down dramatically, still, in the process. I don't think that fertility is a factor here. I think we are somehow educating ourselves to having less children and so on. So there is a labor shortage all over the place, and human ingenuity require more children. That's my point of view, but okay, this is my own.
So let me just respond to it. There are two elements in the fertility decline. There is one that is not up to debate, which is the importance of the fertility decline in bringing about the takeoff from stagnation to growth. So historically, this was a critical force. In the absence of this force, we would still be in a Malthusian world. Moving forward, the question is, do we need further decline in fertility? Well, it depends in which society you operate. If you operate in Western European societies where fertility rates is below replacement, again, it's not necessarily a force that will lead to greater prosperity. But if you live in Africa where total fertility rate is still about 4 children per woman, there could be tremendous benefit from further decline in fertility. So for the globe as a whole, in fact, a decline in fertility will be beneficial for the West. Again, we are passing this point in which fertility was so important, but it is very important to realize that in the absence of the decline in fertility, in the absence of these demographic forces, we would not be here to discuss these issues over the internet. We would still use other tools in our communication, and we would still be very backward in the West and in other places across the globe.
Okay, discussion to be continued. I would like again to thank Oded Galor and to congratulate you for getting the honorary degree at University of Athens, and hopefully in the name of the organization and the organizers, we will all be happy to see you in Spain and in Portugal next year and in person. And thank you very much. Bye.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good, and we are moving to the next section. So I'm inviting all the 4 panelists and Pablo to chair the meeting. Presentation.